what the Oval Office never admits. Every presidency has a public story, carefully shaped messages, clear positions, confident explanations. But inside the Oval Office, there's another reality, 97-1, that is rarely spoken aloud and never acknowledged directly. This matters because leadership is not only about what is said, it is also about what cannot be said. The doubts that remain unspoken, the limits that are understood but never announced, the truths that, if admitted publicly, would weaken authority instantly. Inside the White House, these unspoken realities shape decisions every day, not as secrets, but as constraints. Leaders know what cannot be promised, what cannot be controlled, what cannot be fixed without unacceptable cost. And yet, the public narrative must remain coherent, confident, and decisive. The tension begins early. Briefings present best cases. Messaging emphasizes control. But behind closed doors, language is different. Probabilities replace assurances. Risks are acknowledged without comfort. The gap between what is known and what is said widens quietly. The president feels this weight constantly. Every statement becomes a calculation, not just of truth, but of consequence. Admitting uncertainty may be honest 97, but it can destabilize allies, markets, and institutions. Projecting certainty may be incomplete 97, but it preserves order. This is a contradiction the Oval Office never admits. Leadership often requires presenting confidence while managing doubt, speaking with clarity while navigating ambiguity, appearing in control while knowing how fragile that control truly is. At first, this feels manageable. Messaging and reality remain loosely aligned, but over time, pressure builds. Events test assumptions. Outcomes diverge from expectation. The unspoken truths grow heavier, harder to contain behind carefully chosen words. The danger is not dishonesty. It is distance. When the gap between internal understanding and public narrative grows too wide, leadership risks becoming performative. Decisions may still be made responsibly, 97, but trust becomes harder to sustain. This is where the story begins. Not with scandal or revelation, but with silence, with the things everyone inside the room understands and no one outside ever hears. Because what the Oval Office never admits often shapes leadership more than anything it ever says. As the gap between private understanding and public messaging widened, the strain became harder to manage. Internally, advisors spoke in probabilities and contingencies. Externally, statements remained confident and composed. The two realities coexisted, but they pulled against each other constantly. Inside the White House, this created a quiet discipline. Certain phrases were avoided. Certain admissions were reserved strictly for closed rooms, not because they were false, but because they were destabilizing if spoken openly. The system learned to protect itself through omission. The president understood the necessity of this restraint. Public confidence is a form of infrastructure. Once shaken, it is difficult to rebuild. Markets react. Allies hesitate. Opponents probe. Acknowledging uncertainty can sometimes cause more damage than the uncertainty itself. But this discipline came at a cost. Advisors began filtering not just what was said publicly, but how problems were framed internally. When public narrative becomes fixed, internal discussion can start bending toward it. Risks that contradict messaging feel harder to elevate. Doubts become quieter. The president senses tension during briefings that felt increasingly careful. Language was precise but guarded. The goal was no longer just accuracy, but alignment with what had already been communicated. Reality was still present 97, but it was being managed. This is where the danger deepens. When leaders must constantly protect the story begins to influence decisions. Choices are shaped not only by what is effective, but by what can be explained without contradiction. The unspoken truths remain, but they lose leverage. The conflict sharpened as events tested the narrative. New information complicated old assurances. Adjustments became necessary, but difficult to justify without exposing earlier uncertainty. The space for honest correction narrowed. The Oval Office now faced a familiar but unforgiving dilemma: preserve confidence by maintaining the narrative, or risk credibility by aligning words more closely with reality. Neither path was clean, Both carried consequence, because what the Oval Office never admits does not disappear. It waits, and when pressure rises, unspoken truths have a way of demanding to be reckoned with. The conflict reached its peak when reality began to contradict the narrative too clearly to manage quietly. Internal assessments no longer aligned with public confidence. Adjustments were needed, 97 not later, but now, and each adjustment threatened to expose how much uncertainty had been carried all along. Advisors debated how far the truth could bend without breaking trust. Some argued that gradual shifts in messaging could absorb the change. Others warned that incremental correction would only deepen suspicion. The longer uncertainty had been hidden, the more dangerous its exposure became. The president felt the weight of that contradiction intensely. Leadership demanded honesty, but honesty carried risk. Admitting limits could restore credibility 97 or fracture it permanently. The public expects certainty from the Oval Office, even when certainty does not exist. This was the emotional apex. Not fear, but reckoning. Reckoning with the cost of maintaining a narrative that no longer fit the facts. Reckoning with the realization that confidence, once overstated, becomes a trap. The more it is repeated, the harder it is to step back from. Silence filled the room as the implications became unavoidable. Continuing as before would require deeper omission. Acknowledging reality would invite scrutiny and criticism. Either way, the unspoken truths were now exerting pressure of their own. The president recognized a hard lesson. What the Oval Office never admits does not remain neutral. Over time, it shapes decisions, narrows options, and accumulates debt. Eventually, that debt must be paid, 97 either through correction or crisis. The buildup resolved into a single understanding. The question was no longer whether to acknowledge reality, but how to do so without undermining the very stability leadership is meant to protect. This was not a choice between truth and deception. It was a choice between controlled honesty now or forced revelation later, and the moment to decide had arrived. The resolution came through measured transparency, not a confession, not a dramatic reversal, but a deliberate narrowing of the gap between what was known and what was said. The president chose to recalibrate language carefully, aligning expectations with reality without surrendering authority. Inside the White House, this shift was handled with precision. Statements became more conditional. Certainty gave way to credibility. Limits were acknowledged indirectly, framed as evolving conditions rather than past misjudgment. The narrative did not collapse, 97 adjusted. The effect was subtle but stabilizing. Allies responded with increased trust, sensing realism rather than retreat. Institutions adapted more effectively, guided by signals that reflected actual constraints. Even critics found less ground to exploit, as honesty removed the shock value of later adjustments. This approach did not eliminate doubt. It integrated it. Leadership accepted that projecting absolute certainty was less sustainable than projecting resilience. By bringing internal understanding closer to public language, the Oval Office reduced the pressure of maintaining a story that reality could no longer support. Over time, decision-making improved. Advisors spoke more freely. Risks were surfaced earlier. Corrections felt intentional instead of reactive. The system regained flexibility not by admitting weakness, but by acknowledging complexity. What the Oval Office never admits is not always a secret. Sometimes it is simply uncertainty carried quietly to protect stability. But when that silence grows too heavy, it begins shaping leadership from the shadows. This moment mattered because it showed a different kind of strength, not the strength of appearing infallible, but the strength of adapting before contradiction turns into crisis, the willingness to evolve without spectacle. Leadership did not lose authority here. It preserved it, because the most durable confidence is not built on pretending certainty exists 97, but on proving you can lead responsibly even when it does not. Subscribe to join the journey.